Welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. We are very pleased to gather with you on Equal Pay Day 2023. Equal Pay Day marks the date in the year that women must work to be paid what men made in the previous year. On average, a full-time woman worker is paid just 84% of the average man. This was started by the National Committee on Pay Equity in 1996, and the goal of Equal Pay Day is to raise awareness about the gender wage gap. But it's not just a gender wage gap. Black, Indigenous, and women of color earn less than white men and women. In 2023, Black women's Equal Pay Day is July 27th, Latinas Equal Pay Day is October 5th, and Native women's Equal Pay Day is November 30th. Clearly, there is still a great deal of work to be done to rectify these inequalities. So I have the pleasure of introducing today's speakers to you, Christina Ewig and Youngmin Xu. Youngmin Xu is a Ph.D. student in public affairs at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Her research interests are in gender and work, and she is working on a dissertation on the impact of technology on gender inequalities in the US labor force. Professor Christina Ewig is the director of the Center on Women, Gender, and Public Policy. As director of the center, Dr. Ewig works to stimulate research, teaching, and public engagement on gender and its intersections with other forms of inequality. And I'm Jayne Swift, and I'm the communications manager here at the Center on Women, Gender, and Public Policy. So we thought we'd start with telling you a little bit about the Center on Women, Gender, and Public Policy. What is it that we do here? Christina, would you elaborate?
Sure. Well, the Center on Women, Gender, and Public Policy was founded in 1984 as the first center of its kind in the nation, located in a school of public policy with really a comprehensive focus of teaching. We have a official gender concentration in gender and public policy, the only comprehensive public policy school in the nation to have this, along with engagement with partners locally as well as nationally, as well as research. And so the fact sheet that we're presenting today is part of that research enterprise that we have.
Great. Would you be willing to tell us a little bit more about what prompted the creation of this fact sheet?
Well, the center has a long track record of conducting research, a lot of it related to the disparities that we see of gender and its relationship with other forms of inequality like race and place and disability in the Minnesota context. One of our flagship research projects that we do in partnership with the Women's Foundation of Minnesota is the Status on Women and Girls report. That really is a deep dive into a number of areas and has been really useful, I think, for policymakers and advocates across the state. We also do other deep dives. Recently, we've been focused on COVID and work with a comprehensive report on the gender and race impacts of the COVID pandemic on the Minnesota workforce, and a more recent piece, Essential and Exiting, that focused on direct care workers and the impacts of COVID on direct care workers. So in doing this range of research, we've decided to move to some fact sheets as a series of fact sheets where this is the first of a number of fact sheets, which are a lighter touch. So giving some quick and fast details of data that can be regularly updated and hopefully useful to policymakers and advocates to have some quick data at their fingertips.
That's fantastic. So maybe, Youngmin, could you tell us a little bit about why specifically we could use a fact sheet on employment in Minnesota?
Sure. So inequality, especially economic inequality, is linked to all other aspects of life, such as physical and mental health, education, job opportunities, average life expectancy, housing, and crime. And gender, which is a social structure, is the most critical factor contributing to inequality in the labor market. So who earns, like who gets what and when and how, tells us how and why the gender gap persists in the labor market and how to reduce this gap. Especially in this report, we focus on employment and wages, which is the price of labor, because these are the key criterion for measuring the labor market outcomes and different groups' economic status. And for analysis, we also try to consider women's intersectionality, particularly their race and ethnicity and parental status. We hope this report can provide useful information to the public, policymakers, and researchers.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you for giving us a little introduction about the series. Let's maybe do a deeper dive into who earns. So I think probably a lot of us are curious to find out how Minnesota compares to other states in terms of gender inequality in employment and earnings.
Yeah, I think what we have is a paradox in Minnesota when it comes to women's employment, in that we've been consistently 1 or 2 in the nation in terms of women in the labor force. Right now we are 2, second to the District of Columbia. That means that 61% of women over age 16 are in the workforce, and we have an even higher number of women that are mothers of children under 6 in the workforce at 79%. So that's something that has been pretty consistent over time and something to be proud of in our state. On the other hand, we are stagnating in terms of the gender wage gap and what women earn relative to men. And that's something that when we look at this graph here over time has changed very little over the past 10 years. And we're in a middling state in the sense that 31 states have smaller wage gaps than Minnesota does when it comes to the gender wage gap.
So you mentioned previously the desire and the need for all of our research to be intersectional. So I'm wondering if one of you could elaborate a little bit more about how race and ethnicity impacted the gender wage gap. So for instance, how are, Black, Latina, and Native women faring in comparison to white men?
Yeah, so this graph shows the gender wage disparity in Minnesota by race and ethnicity. We created a graph showing the average wage and salary income of various racial and ethnic groups in comparison to a white man. So when we see the main categories, the bold text, when white men earn $1 on the gray line, white women earn 78 cents and Asian women earn 79 cents. And Native American, Black, and Latinx earnings are much lower than white and Asian American in Minnesota. While white men earn $1, Black and Native American women and Latina earn 55 to 60 cents. In the research we do at the center, we value an intersectional approach, as Jayne said. And for our work in Minnesota, that means taking not only about the major ethnic and racial groups in the US, such as Black, white, Asian, Native American, and Latinx, but also considering the largest immigrant and refugee groups in the state. So when we break down Asian, for example, and pull out the 2 largest Asian groups, we see that there is a huge difference between Asian Indian women's wages and those of Hmong women. So these differences are not obvious when we just look at the categories Asian altogether. So pulling it apart tells us that we need to place a lot more focus on Hmong women's and men's economic opportunities in the States. And we can also find discrepancies among Black people. When we break down Black people into subgroups, we can see Somali women earn the least compared to all other groups. This shows that the the disadvantages economic position of Somali women in Minnesota labor market. And the wage gap within each racial group, racial and ethnic group is the highest among Indian American. And this gap is fairly high among white people, and it's relatively low among Black population.
Yeah, that's incredibly important information. So, of course, one of the things that eventually comes up when we're thinking about the wage gap are what are the primary drivers of it? So what's causing the gender and racial inequalities that we're seeing in employment and earnings?
So there are several factors that can affect gender and racial inequality in employment and earnings, and scholars haven't came to a consensus yet. But historically, labor economists argue that gender and racial wage gap in the labor market is due to differences in education and skills. But these gaps, especially the gender wage gap, persist even after women's educational level surpassed that of men about 10 years ago. So now researchers attribute the gender and racial gap to a combination of factors, including differences in education, occupational clustering, and experience. So, and the remaining gap, after considering these all factors, is suggested to be the result of gender biases, including discrimination. So this figure here is from one of the most influential research. And the authors found that about 38% of the gender wage gap is attributable to discrimination.
Wow. Okay, so it sounds like occupational segregation and unexplained factors such as discrimination, along with experience deficits, are really important here. Maybe we could go a little bit deeper into one of these. So for instance, how is occupational segregation resulting in the wage gap?
So due to gender and racial biases, as we said before, girls and people of color are discouraged from pursuing careers in certain fields or have fewer opportunities to enter a specific field. Also, because women and people of color tend to be discriminated against in the labor market, they are segregated into certain occupations that pay relatively less than male or white-dominated occupations. So, but we can't say for sure that this is the primary driver, but it certainly influences the gender and racial wage gap in the labor market.
Christina, would you like to elaborate on what you see happening with occupational segregation?
Yeah, I mean, I think here we have on the next slide some comparisons here that can maybe give us a bit of an image. We think about certain kinds of jobs have tended to be feminized and racialized over time. And there's data to prove that. So for example, in Minnesota, childcare providers are 94% female. And they have an hourly wage of $14 an hour. Now, most childcare providers have some college education when we look on average and look at the statistics on them in the state. But let's compare that to janitors. Very heavily male, only 29% female in the state. More people of color, it's more proportionally specific to the ratio of in the state in which we've got a population that's 79% white in our state. And so here janitors are 73% white. So more people of color, but more male, and making $3 an hour more than childcare providers. So it's a comparison here of a highly feminized compared to a highly masculine occupation, with janitors on average having just a high school degree. So there's not an education. In fact, it's a lopsidedness in terms of education here, yet one group is earning more than the other. It's largely due to that concentration of men in the janitorial profession versus women in the childcare profession, in which we see a difference in the wages. So concentrations, occupational segregation into specific kinds of fields, some of which can be especially concentrated, like childcare providers or direct healthcare workers, which we have in the next figure there from the right, tends to drive the wages lower simply because of being feminized as an occupation. So these are not just neutral impacts of the market. There's no reason that we should be, in fact, maybe we should be valuing childcare more than janitorial work. That's not to say that they're both important work in our society, but why are we valuing one less than the other? A lot of that goes back to histories of concentration, of a connection that people make historically with what is women's work and devaluing women's work, and what is the work done in particular by women of color historically, who often worked in slavery or in indentured servitude of different kinds. And so those histories still have residue today in terms of how we value particular kinds of work.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So I feel like one of the things that you hear a lot and a lot of sort of emphasis on is the need to help support women get into higher paying jobs, often with a focus on STEM or C-STEM fields. Is that one possible sort of solution to this wage discrepancy issue?
It's one way to go about it, certainly. And I think, as Youngmin mentioned before, there's a socialization effect and a discrimination effect that leads often for certain groups of people to avoid some kinds of work. So we can try to overcome that, encourage people to enter fields that they've traditionally not been encouraged to enter. We also then need to consider the harassment that might take place. We've seen plenty of news stories about harassment in Silicon Valley and very male-dominated STEM workplaces, for example. If we really want that to work, we need to also talk about the environments that we're asking people to enter into. And the other alternative is to go back to what I was suggesting before, which is to value work more, which is traditionally feminine. So on the one hand, there's no reason any person shouldn't have the encouragement to enter into fields that they're interested in, whether they're feminine or masculine in terms of their composition. At the same time, if they want to enter into a field that is feminine and feminized, that work should be just as valued as more masculine dominated sectors.
So one of the other sort of interesting contributions of the report, which I've had a chance to read, of course, is that you find that the majority of part-time workers in Minnesota are women. So why are women choosing part-time work?
So actually, many women choose part-time work or exit paid employment due to care and family responsibilities. And statistics show that the main reason for men working part-time is difficulty in finding full-time work. But for women, looking after children or adults is the main factor. So and shorter working hours and part-time jobs are commonly seen as a way of combining paid and unpaid work. And because women are more likely to take on the majority of unpaid labor, it's unsurprising that more women, or especially mother, work part-time than men. And indeed, in this analysis, we found that women with children are more likely to be out of the labor force or work part-time compared to women without children and men with or without children.
So could I ask a follow-up question that, like, what then is the economic impact of part-time work, or say leaving full-time work for these extra care duties?
So it has long-term consequences for women's lifetime earnings and financial security in old age. Even with similar work experiences and socio-demographic characteristics, women in part-time jobs earn about 20% less than women in full-time jobs in the US. which just suggests that choosing a part-time job can reduce mothers' lifetime earnings significantly. And according to one study I read, a woman who took just 1 year off between 2001 to 2015 earned 39% less than women who did not take such break during the same time. And these losses would be amplified throughout women's lives as they lose retirement benefits, wage growth, and opportunities for promotion and progression.
Yeah, I recall that at the onset of the pandemic, there was sort of a lot of public attention to the possible impact that, lockdowns or business closures would have on gender inequality in terms of employment and earnings. Of course, many women found it necessary at that time to exit the workforce for care duties or were unemployed as a result of closures. So what, if anything, did you all find in terms of the impact that COVID had on women's employment?
Yeah, so we found that a lot of female workers in Minnesota left employment as a result of unexpected rise in care obligations when schools and childcare centers shut down due to the COVID-19, and others had to leave the labor market as businesses closed. And this graph shows that the gap in the labor force participation rate between mothers and fathers was about 10% pre-pandemic, and this gap even more increased during the pandemic. So fathers' labor force participation, which is the blue line, decreased by about 4 percentage points from 2019 to 2021. And this figure remained above 90% throughout the pandemic. Whereas mothers' labor force participation rate decreased by about 6 percentage points between the same period. And we pull out mothers with children under the age of 7 because they experienced the biggest drops in terms of labor force participation rate in Minnesota. But one thing that's hopeful is that these mothers who left the labor market are returning to the workforce. So you can see the upward trend during the 2021 to 2022. But it doesn't mean that they got a job, because labor force participation rate just consider people who just try to find a job.
That's a really interesting piece of information. I mean, you've all offered a really rich portrait here of what gender inequality in employment looks like in Minnesota. I could imagine, however, that some might say that, if women are choosing to enter into it like a certain sector of the workforce, or if they're leaving full-time work for care duties, then maybe that's their choice, and it makes sense that they would earn less. In other words, we shouldn't care too much about pay discrepancies when they are due to factors other than direct discrimination in the workplace. And I'm just wondering what you two, as the authors of this report, would say to those skeptics.
I think it circles back to our values again, Jayne. Taking time off to care for children, to care for elders. Do we value that as a society? If we do, then why are certain people punished for taking that time out? And then stepping back to our socialization of why we think it's the responsibility of women more than men to take that time out during the COVID pandemic, for women to drop out of the workforce rather than men, or to see greater equity between men and women caregivers. So I think, stepping back and asking about our values, but then also recognizing the role of socialization that leads to what we think of as choices. Choices aren't necessarily, they're not made in a vacuum. But we are surrounded every day by everyday interactions, whether it be in the family, whether it be in our school systems, whether it be in the workforce, that direct individuals in particular ways to take particular kinds of jobs instead of other kinds of jobs. And this can be from what a parent might suggest to government training programs that might be helping people to find jobs in particular sectors and assuming that women are better suited for some kinds of jobs than other kinds of jobs. All of this adds up to socialization and not necessarily simply choices. And so once we think about our values and socialization, I think it's harder to say, well, it was just simply a choice of individuals and they need to live with the consequences.
That makes sense. So a question I had for both of you is, what, if anything, surprised you in conducting this research about gender and employment? Were there any findings or data points that you found particularly interesting?
Yeah, for me, the thing always surprises me is that gender segregation in the labor market is a universal phenomenon, and it's very stubborn. So, and something that makes me even more sad is reducing gender segregation is not likely to eliminate the gender wage gap, like Christina mentioned about value and everything, socialization. Recently, I read an article about wage feminization. They found that when women are getting into male-dominated field, those occupations experience wage erosion. So this means that we need to value what women are doing in addition to trying to reduce labor market segregation.
Yeah, and I think for me the big surprise was the graph we have up here about COVID-19. Youngmin and I took a long time to figure out exactly how to read the data and determine what the impacts of COVID had been on labor market participation. And when we were in the midst of the COVID closures and we were witnessing those drops that you see in the 2020 column of this graph of women exiting the labor force in droves, there's a lot of gloom and doom that was being said by women's organizations across the country, which does have still has some contemporary impacts in terms of the loss of wages that women will have and carry with them through their lifetime for having dropped out of the labor force for that period of time. But I was surprised to see in 2022 the recovery that we saw, because a lot of the gloom and doom also spoke to the belief that we would lose decades of progress that we had made in terms of women's engagement in the workforce. And that we're not seeing, at least in the Minnesota context.
That is very interesting. I'm wondering if we could turn a little bit to thinking about what we do with this information and how we might begin to sort of combat or address these problems. So Who Earns notes that the gender pay gap has remained stable in the US over the last 20 years, with women earning about 81% of what men earn. And these discrepancies in pay, you've pointed out, are clearly even more pronounced when we factor in race and ethnicity. So clearly the pay gap has persisted despite the fact that laws and policies sort of officially forbid pay discrimination. So what do we need to change in our employment sector, and what can policymakers do on this front?
I think that Youngmin is right that desegregating occupations is tough, very difficult. It accounts for a big part of the wage gap, but how do we actually overcome it? Minnesota is one among a few states in the nation that has what we call comparative worth legislation. It was passed in 1982, and it has been held up as model legislation for attacking occupational segregation, but it only applies to government work. So what comparative worth legislation does is it asks employers to develop an evaluation of comparable skills and experience that are required for different jobs. So and then to pay those jobs equally. So they may be very different kinds of work, maybe a feminized occupation and a very masculine dominated occupation. But if there's similar degrees of skill that's required for those jobs, they should be paid similarly. So there's a whole formula that's used. And it's been very good in our state for equalizing wages within the public sector. Expanding that to the private sector would be a way of trying to address some of the occupational segregation that we have. That, of course, would require private sector cooperation with that, but that would be one option. And another option is one that we also have tried based upon the 2014 Women's Economic Security Act. There is an element of that act to establish a grant program to encourage women to seek other pathways into non-traditional fields, whether it's construction, for example. It is a program that hasn't been rigorously evaluated. And I think it's something that we can revisit to think about the effectiveness of it and whether or not it could be expanded or strengthened. So those would be two ways to potentially address segregation of occupations in the state.
So if we turn a little bit to thinking about how to combat discrimination in workplaces, I think many have sort of begun to argue that the sort of equal pay for equal work paradigm that's been enshrined in law from the Equal Pay Act of 1963 on has been sort of inadequate for addressing sort of the roots of discrimination in the workplace in a lot of ways. So for instance, it can be really hard to know if you're being discriminated against on the job. We're often taught it's not appropriate to talk about money or pay or ask potential employers about salaries. And it can be really burdensome to ask employees to be the watchdogs of their employers. Are there ways that we can better incentivize employers to combat pay discrimination?
I think we can think about these three policies on the slide. First one is prohibiting pay history discussions. For this law, the hope is that employers will be more likely to base offers on what the job should pay, not on what the candidate has earned in the past. When you think about women and people of color are typically earn less than white men due to discrimination, prohibiting pay history discussions would benefit workers to get fair wage. And the second one is implementing wage transparency law. And research shows that salary transparency helps close wage gaps. And salary range information helps current employees evaluate whether they are being paid fairly and negotiate with their employers to resolve pay disparities. Or if an employer refuses to pay market rate, I think they can seek new job opportunities that pay fairly. And the third one is expanding Minnesota Equal Pay Certificate. The 2014 Women's Economic Security Act requires large firms to pay men and women equal wages for equal work and obtain equal pay certificate. And we think that expanding this certificate to smaller contractors would be helpful in reducing the gender wage gap in Minnesota.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So one other angle or issue that you pointed to was the question of experience gaps. Are there some ways that we can better address the care penalty that causes these differences in experience and then ultimately wages and earnings for women?
I think the number one answer to that is affordable childcare. So a lot of times families make short-term decisions that make a lot of fiscal sense in the short term, that especially in light of the wage gap, if in a heterosexual couple, if a woman is earning less than her male partner, it makes more fiscal sense in the short term for that partner to work part-time or drop out of the labor force when childcare can cost as much as an individual's salary. So that, however, has the long-term consequences that we've been talking about of losing experience and losing wages and pay increases over time. But for those women that do want to work full-time, affordable childcare would be would be the key to addressing this experience gap that then contributes to the wage gap.
Thanks for that. So we're also living in a moment in which there's been a lot of increased attention to economic inequality, and specifically its gender and racial dimensions. We know that most people are working in the service sector and not, say, in white collar or professional jobs. And, without sort of a dramatic change in our kind of national economic system, the dominance of service sector employment is likely to continue. You've also pointed out in the fact sheet that women of color are disproportionately represented in the service sector, often doing very physically and emotionally demanding jobs for low wages. What are the things that we can do to address pay inequities for this often majority of workers?
A really simple thing we can do is raise the minimum wage and raise it to a living wage. When you think about the examples that we laid out between the childcare provider and the janitor, for example, simply raising the floor is going to do a lot to address these lowest paid workers, and bring them up, and compress some of that gap in wages between occupations. What we have here is from Hennepin County, the living wage that is calculated by Hennepin County. And we can see that a family of one adult with one child, the living wage is considered to be $37.61 an hour. That's a far cry from the $10.59 minimum wage that we have for the state in 2023, or even the higher local level wages of $15 an hour and change that we have in Minneapolis and St. Paul. So one simple solution, rather than going into some of the complexities like the comparative worth and so on, would affect a lot of people. Another thing that could be done is to support unionization efforts. These sectors are ones that often are not unionized in the service sector, for example, or less unionized than in other areas. And we know from research that unionization raises wages. So that's another approach.
Great. Well, at this time, I would love to invite audience members to leave a question in the question and answer box, and we'll take a look at that. While we sort of turn to a couple of last questions that we had here. Specifically, I was wondering if you think there are any specific ways that we can push, or better yet, support policymakers in Minnesota to address some of these gender and employment inequities. What can we do as readers of this report and people who are interested in this issue?
I feel like we do making publishing a lot of reports would be one way to get some interest from policymakers. And I think always the key is having interest in this inequality, and raise your voice and talk about that is always the key to get some support from policymakers and address the gender and employment inequality in the labor market.
Yeah, Equal Pay Day is a good day for us to sit back and step back and realize, how long has it been? How far are we into the year before women are earning the same as men earned the previous year? And it's a pretty long time, thinking about months of paychecks and how many groceries could be purchased, how much investment could be made in families. in long-term security and wealth building. So the gender wage gap has big effects, not just for women, but for families and for well-being of everyone in the state. But as we've seen from our initial figures that we presented, it's been stagnant for way too long. So I'm hopeful, research by itself does not move policy, but I'm hopeful that accessible research can help policymakers to see that this has been something that's gone unaddressed for too long. I know that some folks in the legislature are interested in this, and we are hopeful that the data that we can provide can help them to move the dial, but also for advocates on the ground, right? So as Youngmin said, it's policy movement only happens when constituents mobilize and ask for it to happen.
You both mentioned briefly sort of the economic, clearly this has a major economic impact on those of us who are most affected by the wage gap. But beyond the question of, say, more money, more savings, greater sort of lifetime economic security, what do you feel like we might gain from greater equality in employment and economic practices more broadly?
Right. Yeah. I think economic inequality, like I said, connect to everything, like physical and mental health, housing, and other aspects of our life. So, I read a lot of research that economic discrimination relates to poorer mental health among minorities and women. So I think on top of in addition to monetary gain, people can live happier life with better well-being and with other people, and that is the most important things. So the economic inequality, by improving, reducing economic inequality, we can improve people's health and other aspects of life.
Yeah, I think Youngmin said it well. Our economic well-being connects to every facet of our life, including health and happiness. And so addressing this can only have broad positive consequences in all aspects of the lives that we live. Looks like we have a question from the audience there.
Yes, that's true. So this question is about unionization as a way to close the wage gap. The question is, what policies could be put into place to support unionization efforts for childcare givers, takers, and other majority female occupations? So what are things that we could do to support unionization efforts in female dominant occupations?
That's a great question. I mean, on the one hand, we have legislation that can support unionization, but when we think about childcare providers, a lot of them, we have different kinds of childcare providers, some of which work in larger childcare facilities that may be connected to an employer or to meaning a larger employer, or maybe in a network with other providers. But we also have in-home childcare providers that are atomized, right, and not necessarily connected. So that's that does make it more difficult to unionize those workers in particular. And so I don't have a straightforward answer to that.
I have an example for that in Minnesota.
Right.
I read an article about home health care in Minnesota workers. They did collective bargaining, and they won the like huge increase in terms of wage. So maybe supporting the collective bargaining of those workers and help them to unionized from maybe that kind of policies would be helpful for them to increase their wage or get some like fair wage and some get some like benefits from the from employers. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that would work for those that are working for employers and not necessarily working for themselves, right?
Yeah.
So with the two different classes of childcare providers, it would be unionization is an option for one, but probably not for the others that are providing at-home care where it's their own small business. And so, yeah. Looks like we have another question here. Do you want to read it, Jayne?
Sure. So this is anyone pushing for free childcare, take K through 12 budgets and increase by a third. Lots of money, but probably could be done through vouchers. So current providers could continue. So the question seems to be about whether or not we could increase K through 12 budgets as a mechanism for creating sort of more childcare options.
Yeah, this has actually been sort of the under the radar way in which a number of different states have been extending childcare availability and increasing childcare in a way that it's not called childcare, it's school. So moving to having having 4-year-old kindergarten, 3-year-old kindergarten, these are ways in which then school districts, taxpayers take up the cost of that care. And we also know the quality of the care because it's being provided through school districts with the specific licensing requirements and so on within those districts. And so we also know that that kind of education is beneficial for children to have that early childhood education. And so that has been a strategy to deal with the childcare deficit of providers that we have, as well as the affordability. So extending that and extending care in that way is one way. It doesn't get to the most expensive childcare, which is infant care. And there we still will need other kinds of childcare providers and subsidies for families and for providers for providing that care. But yes, K4 and K3 schooling is another approach.
Well, I want to thank both of you for putting together this incredible piece of information and the report. We invite all of you to take a fuller, deeper dive into the report. You can read it in full on our website using the Z link on the screen here. As well, as Christina mentioned, this is just the first of a series of fact sheets. And I hope that you can join us next week for our launch of the second fact sheet in the series, Who Cares? A Fact Sheet on Unpaid Care Work in Minnesota. So this fact sheet explores the contribution that unpaid care work makes to Minnesota's economy and policies that can best address gender disparities in care work. Thank you all very much for joining us today on Equal Pay Day for this conversation about the gender wage gap in Minnesota and what we can do about it.